I'm not really a fan of horror stories, but I wanted to read this book because I knew that it had a wide readership, even now more than 100 years after it was published. According to Wikipedia, there's been something like 200 plus movies that have been made that involve vampires one way or the other. I think the best I've seen were the original with Bela Lugosi and the one with Gary Oldman, which I think was made sometime in the 1990s. So I was curious to see where it all started. Now, we're all familiar with the plot. You've got this count living in a real spooky castle in Transylvania near the Burgo Pass, which none of us have probably ever heard of. The count is more or less your standard blood-sucking vampire. He's decided to move to England. Well, he's looking for new victims and maybe for some new vampire girlfriends. When he gets to England, he goes after some kids and two women. They're named Lucy and Mina. A group of guys led by some kind of a Dutch professor end up amalgamating Dracula by the end of the book. Now, the way the book is set up is as a kind of a chronological collection of diaries, letters, press clippings, and other stuff. That design actually gives it a kind of an air of realism, believe it or not. And the book is everything you'd expect in a horror story. It's got suspense, fear, violence, gore, and of course the supernatural. Apart from Dracula, the other main characters are Lucy. She's a hot young English girl who's engaged to one of the other characters, and she's the one that ultimately turns into a vampire. There's another gal, her best friend Mina, and Mina, by the way, is a nickname for somebody whose real name is Wilhelmina. I didn't know that until I read the book. You've got Van Helsing. He's the Dutch professor. Then you've got a doctor who's in charge of a lunatic asylum. Great idea. And that would be Dr. Seward. You've got a guy named Lord Godalming, who's Lucy's boyfriend and fiancé. There's Jonathan Harker. He's the lawyer that goes to Transylvania, and he's also Mina's boyfriend. You got a guy from Texas, I guess because why not? And there's one more main character, a guy named Renfield, and he is a first-class lunatic. Now, he's the guy, you may recall, who eats flighters, spies, rats, and other critters. He's just great. I'll tell you what I think of the best scenes in the book. I love the whole first part where Jonathan Harker goes to Transylvania to do the paperwork for the sale of Carfax Abbey to Dracula. That's the way the movie with Bela Lugosi starts, and when you read it, it comes across just as spooky and scary as the movie. After that, I like the whole story of the ship that carries Dracula and his cases of dirt to England. Not much of that in the movie. You'll love the part where they drive a stake through Lucy's heart and cut off her head. Really, really well done. And finally, I liked all the parts that feature Renfield the lunatic. What was great about it was that in addition to suspense and terror, he adds the vital element of disgust. I admit it, I love those scenes. I need to say a word about the style of the book, the writing, the way it comes across. All the characters speak in a very high-class form of English. Now, maybe that's the way people talked in the 19th century, and I guess you'd call the language elevated. It doesn't really put you off because you kind of sort of get used to it. And if you're a Game of Thrones or a Throne of the Dragon fan, you start out pretty well used to that kind of elevated English. On the other hand, I got to say that the sentiments that these people express is pretty much on the syrupy, over sweet side, and I got to say that doesn't do a whole lot for me. But I like the terror and the suspense. Now, Bram Stoker, the guy who wrote this book, was actually an Irishman. But it looked to me like he lived most of his life in England. And I say that because he managed the Lyceum Theatre in London for 27 years. I have a hunch, I think it's important, I have a hunch that his connection to the theater gave him the ideas that he needed to create the atmosphere of gloom and terror that sort of pervades this whole book. As you can tell, I kind of ended up really liking it. I thought it was a little slow moving in the middle, and I really wish that Dracula was in it more. He kind of hovers on the outside of the action, showing up as a mist, a bat, a wolf, and all the stuff that you see in the movies. If you give the book a try, you may end up putting it aside after you get through the first part, the Jonathan Harker and the shipwreck scenes. But if you stay with it, I think you'll find it's a pretty good book. That's my recommendation for this Halloween. Give Dracula a try. I think you'll like it, and I'll see you next week.